Cities in the United States during the 1800s integrated industry, commerce, and residential uses in a way that we don't do anymore. This is true of bigger cities like Philadelphia, New York, Boston, but it's certainly true of Concord as well. It was not thought to be unusual. In fact, it was thought to be highly typical of an American city to have heavy manufacturing virtually at the elbow of retail sales and residential uses. The idea that we had Ford and Kimball's big foundry, and we actually had an adjacent foundry, the Clapp foundry, which was near here, and that we had a manufactory of woodworking machinery on South Main Street in Concord, virtually across the street from houses, and in fact right across the street from the home of Benjamin Ames Kimball, who was the owner of this property, gives you an idea that the mindset of the 19th century was that industry and manufacturing properly should be located right where people lived and where people could walk to work. And in the case of the owner of an operation like this, like Benjamin Kimball, the factory was operating right across the street where he could look out the front window of his home and basically watch where his fortune was being made and where his employees were all working. We also have to remember that just a few feet beyond this row of buildings were the railroad yards of the Concord and Montreal Railroad, later the Boston and Maine Railroad. So we had a major railroad center virtually adjacent to Main Street as well. It's amazing, really, what a single building like this one can do in terms of reflecting the social history and the economic history of a community. We think of these buildings sometimes as somewhat inert. We think of them sometimes as something that are underutilized and need to be removed for a new economic engine of some type. But what we tend to forget is that these buildings actually sheltered within themselves very important parts of the social and economic history of a community. In this building we have the history of musical instrument manufacture in Concord, which was a very big, very important aspect of Concord's economy in the 19th century. We have carpentry and we have pattern making, which is extremely important, with the Ford and Kimball foundry just to the east of this building on adjacent property. Then we have the manufacture of electric motors in the northern end of this building, which was a direct response to the availability of three-phase current being generated by the Sewell Falls electric plant beginning in the 1890s. Then we had, beginning in the 1920s and 1930s, the slow conversion of these buildings to automotive use, and these buildings then embodied the birth of the age of the automobile in Concord, both sales of automobiles, servicing of automobiles, fueling of automobiles. Basically, these buildings welcomed the advent of this new method of transportation. The printing and publishing industry was one of the great claims to fame in Concord. We had many, many presses, many small and large presses, but the king of them all was Rumford Press, which was of national or international significance, stood to the north of here, the northern end of Concord. The binding industry, of course, goes arm in arm with the publishing and printing industry, and at one time, as Mr. Ives has told us, we had several binders working in the Concord area. The New Hampshire bindery is the last survivor, still in active use, still doing binding for Capital Offset Company and various other printers in this area, as well as for printers throughout the eastern or northeastern United States. That too happened under these rules.
We were the only bindery in New Hampshire, which we still are, and I think there was 13 binderies in all in New England, but they were very territorial. So you didn't travel. It was all about how much it cost from point A to point B. So you could capture all the work north of Boston strictly by the fact that we were where we were. And so we had Maine, Vermont, and New Hampshire, and we lived off in those three states. My father gave me the opportunity at one stage when I got out of high school, said, okay, I can either pay you for years of college or you can start working right here, right now. And at that point I had enough of school, so I said, okay. So I started, and my first job here was being a folder operator. Plunked on here like this. Rolled out like this. And put on here like this. And in one stack, and it's stepped. so that when it comes down to the bottom, one sheet at a time gets picked up by the sucker head and runs through. And actually, this is called a buckle folder. There's a set of rollers underneath all of these. 9 o'clock, I used to walk around to all the employees and ask them, okay, what do you want for break? And there'd be coffee, there'd be Claire's, I'd have to go to Janet Stonet's, I'd have to go all these places to pick up all this food. And literally, I'd do that every day. And the owner, at that time, it wasn't my dad, the owner would say, okay, and he'd order something too, and he didn't have a problem with that. That was part of doing business. This is the casing in line, the main binding line of the shop. And what happens is actually 4 different operations going on in one machine, where in the olden days, we have a machine over on the other side called the 3-wing, and we do it all by hand. You line the machine by hand, line the books by machine, and then you'd put them on and it would case them in by hand, where this will do it all at once. So what the man does is he puts the book in, they go in the hopper. This is called a rounding machine, rounder and backer. And what it's doing, it is putting the round in and the backing. This creates the wings so that when a cover goes on, the board of the cover is flush with the spine of the book. If you take a round back book, you should be able to open it up and it should lay flat wherever you open it up. And a flat back book has a tendency to want to close. It isn't as strong, not as strong. It has more tension on the paper, where the round has released the tension through the rounding of the book. It's a traditional way too. Puts a layer of glue on, and then the super actually helps bond the book into the cover. Another layer of glue. The headbands, when these first were designed, they were designed as actually a structural part of the book, but right now they're more of a decorative, and they just make the thing look pretty. They're coming along here, and then they go in between these 2 glue rollers, and the glue is applied to both sides. Apply glue here on this side and on the opposite side, and then the cover is formed and it's set around the book. And then they go in through here, and this is nothing but pressure. It has two formers. One forms the spine, which forms a channel, a crease, so that creates the hinge of the book, and the other one just pressures on the sides, which actually just bonds the book to the cover. So, and after that, they just come out at this end. Typically, a job will run between 25 and 30 books a minute. The old timers used to be about 16 books a minute at the best. And when they come out of here, they're all done. And then what happens is they get piled up here, and the man inspects them here, make sure the headband's stuck, make sure the book is square in the cover. You want to have it nice and square in here. Make sure there's no wrinkles and the end paper isn't stuck from the gluing, and he'll check it. So the very last step is packing of the job, and I can't tell you how I pound it into my help to make sure every book goes out, because this is what the customer sees when he picks it up. He'll open the book up and he'll take a look at it. If we don't pack it right and it gets damaged when it gets sent, the whole job is gone. So he'll shrink wrap them, we'll box them. We box them with paper in between each row. We put a tag on the side of what they are, and we put them on a skid and we ship them out.
Now what we're looking at basically in this part of the building is a structure that's built partially of masonry with load-bearing exterior walls, and then the roof frame is framed with very heavy timber, all sawn on a circular saw, which would have been the technology available and common in the 1870 period when the building was constructed. I think the main difference between construction at that period and right up through, really up through World War II, was that buildings were intended to last indefinitely. They were normally constructed to have an indefinite lifespan, and to serve many different uses over many different generations. Today we tend to build buildings with an expected lifespan that's fairly brief. Sometimes for commercial buildings only 15 or 20 years. And therefore the buildings of today serve a purpose in a functional sense, but they do not represent the same quality of architecture that you have in the older buildings, which were not only built by people who were intending them for indefinite use, but built by traditional methods. For example, if we take a look at the bricks of this building, these bricks would have been fired or vitrified locally. Concord was a major brick making area. This is called the American or common bond, in which every few courses of stretchers, which are bricks that are laid horizontally on their sides, you have a bonding course of what are called headers, which are bricks that are laid at right angles to that with their ends exposed to the exterior of the building. There are two of these stretcher courses side by side in the thickness of the wall, which makes a total, since a brick is about 4 inches wide, makes a total thickness of the wall of about 8 inches. And a brick is about 8 inches long, and therefore the headers that are coming through to tie the inner and outer widths or courses of brick together are right behind this little bit of plaster. Industrial buildings of this period all have load-bearing brick walls, heavy timber floor and roof frames. They tended to be as heavily constructed as possible because it was usually vibrating machinery in the buildings, and you needed to have as much mass in the structure itself as you could to create inertia that would damp the vibrations of that machinery. These trusses were very sophisticated, and they represent very good carpentry, which actually sort of transmits traditions from the 18th century, from the 1700s, right down to the post-Civil War era. There are, for example, these little additional struts which help to pick up the excess pressure from the feet of the top cords or the side cords of the queen post trusses, and these are notched in solidly into the bottom of the bottom cord to pick up the thrust, the pressure that's in this strut. And then if we take a look up at the top, we see similarly there's a compression joint up there with a double little lap joint right into the top cord, which provides the secure anchorage that we need for a member that's taking quite a bit of pressure. In addition, we also have these diagonal wind braces, which are used to link the rafters, or rather the side cords of the trusses, to the purlin up overhead. And the purpose of these is, as denoted by the name wind brace, is to resist racking or twisting of the roof of the building in cases where you have high diagonal winds, so that this stiffens the membrane of the building with some diagonal braces to prevent the building from shifting or changing its position in cases of high wind. Right over here in this location, there was an opening in the wall. You can see the sides of it, and you can see how the bricks that fill in that opening do not line up with the original coursing of the bricks on both sides of it. This may well have been a chute for a coal bin. This area where we're standing may have been a coal bin, and perhaps coal was delivered from the street. You know, the old photographs and the old Sanborn map show that in front of this building, in between it and South Main Street, there were a couple of coal sheds outside the building, and a couple of other utilitarian structures as well, right out sort of at sidewalk level. We're under the northern extension of the 1881 addition, and the reason that we're standing here is that we wanted to take a look at the top of an arch which extends up above the current concrete floor that we see here. This arch was actually the top of a tunnel that extended underneath this building from west to east. And the reason that we had a tunnel here is that to the east of us was the Ford and Kimball foundry. To the west of us is a small wooden building which was the office of the Ford and Kimball foundry. These buildings would have been adjacent to one another and easily accessible one to another until this extension was built in 1881. After 1881, in order to get from the office to the foundry, they wanted to have a direct route, and the only way they could have a direct route with this building in the way was to build themselves what they called a subway. To us, it would just be a tunnel. And so there was a tunnel that extended underneath this building from west at the office, below what must have been a floor in this location, and exited out through the arch that you see in the brick wall here, and through a cleft in a stone retaining wall, which you can still see outside this building, and connected directly into the buildings of the Ford and Kimball foundry. The fact that the top of the arch is actually above the floor that we're standing on, the concrete floor, again suggests that the original floor in this room would have been a wooden floor which would have been somewhat elevated above the level or the elevation of the floor that we're standing on with this concrete floor. When we take a look at the coloration of the wood in this building, we notice that it's considerably darker in appearance and coloration than in the southern end of the building. And the reason for that is that the first floor of this building was a machine and forge shop or blacksmith shop. And this end of the building did metal smithing to a much greater extent than ever occurred on the southern end, which was largely carpentry and musical instrument manufacturing. That in turn created a great deal of soot and heat that rose up through this building and basically colored the structural timbers that are overhead almost to the point of their being black at this point. This building originally had a tower, a stair tower and an entrance tower on the center of the western elevation, the western side of the building. And just inside of that tower there was a freight elevator which extended from the attic down to the second floor and then down to the first floor. And the mechanism for that elevator is still in place, suspended up in the roof trusses above my head. The way in which this mechanism worked, as best we could tell from just looking at the evidence of the hardware, is that it basically had a drum or a wheel that had a leather belt extending over it, and that leather belt would have been connected to the steam-powered machinery in this building, the shafting that ran through the building. In turn, that drum turned a sort of a rack and pinion arrangement or a cog arrangement that turned a drum that had a cable looped over it, and the cable was attached to the car of the elevator, so that it was possible by applying power to one wheel to actually have another one turn and crank up the cable that lifted the elevator up through the building. We know from fire insurance information that this elevator has ceased to be used during the 20th century. Undoubtedly, it was considered to be unsafe and very far from meeting the standards of the elevators that were adapted and developed in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So it was put out of use at that time. Mixed in with all of this heavy industry, all of the smoke and steam and basic atmosphere created by manufacturing was the fact that we had animals subsisting side by side with human beings, doing the work of human beings, and existing in what is a very non-naturalistic environment for animals. And yet, as we all know, the horse can adapt to anything and has adapted over history to everything, including warfare. And so all of these juxtapositions, which would seem so strange and possibly unpleasant or even cruel in the 21st century, were simply taken for granted and were expected as part of life in the 19th century. So all of this gives us a sense of how things have changed, how imperceptibly, little by little, things have been altered, and the railroad has disappeared, the automobile has taken over from the horse, and in some sense, much of that is wrapped up in the fabric of this building itself. So here we see it sort of behind us in altered and somewhat reduced form, but from all of this we can deduce what Concord was like back in the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s, when this seemed to be the wave of the present and the wave of the future.
I like the downtown for a lot of reasons, but manufacturing has no place in downtown. We're the last big industry, if you want to call us big, last major industry on Main Street. Only for the fact that I own the building and I'm lazy, maybe, I don't want to move. We would have moved a long time ago. I have to separate the fact that personally I would love to see this building stay versus the fact that I'm a businessman and my business has to come first. I have 20 employees with families that count on me, and so I have to kind of actually separate myself in that respect. I just can't be emotionally attached.